Dr. Ilya Perlingieri. Perlingieri is the author of The Uterine Crisis, one of the first books to link environmental toxins with the staggering rate of women's reproductive illnesses. In 2006, she was chair of Maine's first global warming conference. She has written for E!, the environmental magazine, and London's The Ecologist. Dr. Perlingieri notes that the issues of a radically changing global environment caused by humans must be addressed now from the local level up.
What's happened to accelerate these changes? The issues surrounding climate change and all of that is multi-layered. It's extremely complex. It doesn't just mean dealing with the climate, but the whole of the biosphere. And we're at the top of a very, very toxic food chain. What I'd like to focus on today in my talk is how weather modification, which was mentioned just briefly in a question, is playing a major role in this rapidity of environmental changes, but also in the vast increases of illness. So let me set the stage with some background. I spent 15 years of independent research for my last book, which is called The Uterine Crisis. It is one of the first books to link the huge environmental crises that we have, multi-layered that they are, with women's reproductive problems. And they are staggering from fetuses in utero all the way to elder women. Though I haven't done the research for you guys, you're not off the hook by any means, because sperm count is down by 50% with all the toxins in the environment. But what I learned with this research is, and it's a staggering figure, if you can even get your mind around it, is that we are exposed on a regular basis to 100,000 chemicals every single day. It depends on the spew, where you are, and I do mean a spew because it's a toxic spew. And most of these have never been tested for human safety. We're the guinea pigs for an experiment that is way out of control. And this is one of the reasons that we have high rates of cancer, although right now cancer is number 2, superseded by heart cardiovascular problems, which is now number 1, and asthma, which I will mention later, is number 3. In addition, there are 8,000 new chemicals that go online every year to which we're also exposed. 8,000. These two have never been tested for human safety. Chemicals and pharmaceuticals are tested one at a time, and because the way things are right now, there are very few independent labs and few independent scientists. So a lot of this is, as I say, the fox is guarding a scenario that's really pretty awful. And we have known really since the 30s, particularly for issues surrounding women's reproductive problems, that tampons were unsafe in the 30s, but a lot of things are covered up, and that has not changed in 70 years. So having the pharmaceutical companies test things or the chemical companies test things doesn't necessarily mean that we're safe if something's put online. In addition, these safety factors that the chemical and the pharmaceutical companies test for, they're testing one chemical at a time. This does not address what Dr. Theo Colburn in Our Stolen Future in 1996 addressed, and that is it's multiple. And one chemical plus one chemical does not equal 2. One chemical plus one chemical could equal, especially in hormone-disrupting chemicals, 1,600 times the dose. And we're all walking time bombs. That is a reality. Everybody in this room. Bill Moyers did a great show about 6 years ago called Trade Secrets, which is still available, I believe, on DVD, looking at this whole issue of the multiplicity of chemicals and the problems that, I should say, of greed have caused for Americans. And as I write in The Uterine Crisis, it's all about greed. It's not about our well-being and safety. And there are countless stories about the problems of people who have become critically ill or died, stories going back to the thalidomide crisis in the 60s and 70s, toxic shock syndrome, pesticide poisonings, which are really off the scale, even for small children, and Vioxx, just to name a few. It was on the market when they knew it was unsafe, and people were spending a fortune so that the companies could make billions of dollars. We are the guinea pigs in a huge and complex experiment where the health and environmental repercussions are absolutely staggering. Babies are now born with what is called the body burden. That is, while they're growing in utero in their mom's bodies, they are already getting a chemical body burden that is passed on through the umbilical cord. And so by birth, these poor, innocent children are already affected. And there are staggering rates of birth deformities, cancers, and other reproductive-related illnesses that we did not have 20 or 30 years ago. When I was growing up, there was no such a thing as a children's hospital. Think about it. We have children's hospitals all over. What has happened? What has happened? Just think about that figure. What does 100,000 chemicals mean in a mixture that is not even being tested in its vast mathematical complicity? We breathe chemicals every day. We eat food grown in heavily pesticided soil, soil that's greatly reduced in beneficial organisms and mineral content from 30 and 40 years ago. We drink water that is highly contaminated with other chemicals, including mercury, as Pat mentioned, and every other kind of spew that you can even imagine. Robert Kennedy Jr. has been working with several water conservation organizations, water keepers, over the last 30 years to try and even clean up the PCBs in the Hudson River. And there have been frequent reports of rocket fuel in mother's milk and found in lettuce. What is that doing in our food supply? Secondly, 30 years of environmental laws have been systematically destroyed over the last 8 years. Americans are exposed to many higher levels of toxins, including mercury, from power plant emissions, as Pat had mentioned, from cement factories, and from multi-prepared vaccinations, the latter of which has resulted in autism, high rates of autism, ADD, and other cognitive troubles. For centuries, we've known that mercury, probably thousands of years, that mercury is deadly. There is no safe level of mercury, not at all. The Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland is based on the 17th and 18th century real Mad Hatters who died and went crazy before they did because of the use of mercury in making those tall hats that we see in historical paintings. There's no safe level, as I mentioned, of mercury. It takes decades to work its deadly action, and in a person's later years, brain function and cognition deteriorate and death ensues. I've seen it with my own mother, who was one of the leading dentists in the United States for 47 years. I've seen it with friends, and it's a pretty awful scenario to see somebody who was brilliant not even be able to communicate. Mercury is unsafe, and we are breathing it as we speak. Thirdly, in regard to climate change, there has been new research from several scientists just in this past year showing dwindling to no sunspot activity from our sun. The science is not perfect. We've heard from people earlier today saying it's a consensus and everything's always up for re-examination. But this lack of sunspot activity could indicate from several scientists, if you need the websites and the particular references, I'll be glad to give them to you after my talk. This might be indicating that we're entering what is known as a Maunder minimum that is similar to the ice age that was mentioned earlier during the 17th century. This may indicate that, in fact, maybe the climate is not getting warmer, but much cooler. We just don't know. This is all up for changes. I will say, living in Maine and having just moved from California, and that's another story, Maine this past winter had 16 feet of snow. It's the highest, most significant snow level that we've had since records began to be kept during the 1870s. So this is all something that it's still a process that we still don't know what's going to happen. Finally, the fourth issue are the brown clouds that we mentioned just earlier. Does anybody know about the brown clouds other than Dr. Young? 2 people. Okay, since last year and a little bit earlier, NASA has retrofitted a number of planes, and an international scientific team has been put together under Dr. V. Ramanathan at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. They are tracking, starting April last year, there was big articles in the Wall Street Journal and all over the West Coast, though it didn't seem to get the kind of attention I would have hoped. This international team has been tracking the pollution from India and from China, and the clouds really are brown, and I can tell you from living in California for 35 years that we don't see them here as much, but they're here because we're in a closed loop, and what affects one part of the country eventually comes around and hits other parts of the planet. But the pollution is filled with industrial pollution that includes soot, heavy metals, urban exhaust, power plant emissions, including more mercury, acid, ash from coal-fired plants, home heating stoves, and forest fires. The highly toxic pollution is measured in what are known as teragrams. 1 teragram equals 2.2 billion pounds of toxic soot and assorted other things that are coming here from China. It takes about a week, give or take, the weather. So in addition to our own pollution figures, we are now getting more than 40 billion pounds of pollution annually from Asia. And pollution figures have doubled over the last 20 years. The U.S. gets the heaviest load of these brown clouds during the springtime and less over the summer. This is a global issue, and we certainly as Americans haven't been stepping up to the plate. A survey report issued by the World Bank in 2007 estimates that there are about 460,000 premature Chinese deaths a year just from breathing polluted air and drinking poisoned water, although this was questioned by an official of China's State Environmental Protection Administration saying that it was baseless. However, the Financial Times and the Chinese government, which conducted this research in partnership with the World Bank, asked that the lender, that is the World Bank, not publish these estimates for fear that it could trigger social unrest. China is beset by growing public alarm about acid rain and toxic water, and has promised by 2010 to cut their pollutants by 10%, but even last year they failed to meet last year's measurements that they had done. The United States got its own shameful statistics, and I'd like to just give you some of them. Car emissions, which include benzene, which is highly toxic and causes cardiovascular problems and an elevated blood pressure, kills 30,000 Americans each year. The risk of cancer from breathing diesel exhaust that we breathe every day is about 10 times more than ingesting all other toxic pollutants combined, with diesel emissions contributing to over 70% of the cancer risk from air pollution in the United States. Third, we take the equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes every day, even if we're non-smokers, just due to air pollution that we're breathing every second. The Boston area ranks number 5 in the country for premature deaths due to diesel pollution annually. And in the state of Massachusetts alone, diesel emissions are responsible for the following figures of annual statistics: 450 premature deaths, 700 non-fatal heart attacks, 9,900 asthma attacks, 13,000 respirator symptoms in children, and 60,000 lost workdays. According to the EPA, emissions from power plants contribute to over 2,800 lung cancers and deaths and 38,200 heart attacks annually in the United States. So this is just a little bit of what we are dealing with in terms of figures of toxicity in the air that we breathe every day. This does not include weather modification. Ancient cultures used to do native tribal dances to pray for rain, to bring areas that were very dry and have good rainfall. In the 20th century, clouds were seeded by numerous countries around the globe with various chemicals to produce rain. China was just doing this over the summer in Beijing to make sure that there weren't any rain, that there wasn't any rain during the Olympics. But all this has changed dramatically with the U.S. military's secretive research and plans to control the planet's natural weather. This has not been given very much press, and we have to remember that we have a corporate-owned press where 85% of radio, television, and print media is owned by 5 corporations. So they're not going to talk about things that are of really serious consequence, and that's somewhat of the blessing, a mixed blessing of the internet, but there's certainly plenty of information on weather modification. The Air Force is on record as saying, quote, they want to control the weather by 2025, and we are not talking about just seeding the clouds for rain. Weather modification means, quote, any activity performed with the intention of producing artificial changes in the composition, behavior, or dynamics of the atmosphere, unquote. And as of April this year, there are more than 150 different weather modification programs around the world. Since about 2000, the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy have been spraying the entire United States sky with a toxic brew of chemicals and other biologic agents. Do we have that? Can we do that? Just want to show you something. We have 2 different kinds of trails in the sky right now. One are called contrails. How many of you know what contrails are? Contrails are what have been around from the ends of planes since World War II. These are very, very short exhaust trails that usually evaporate within a few minutes. You just look up at the sky and you'll just see a jet, sometimes with 4 trails, but it evaporates pretty quickly. How many of you know what chemtrails are? Nobody. The military and some commercial planes are spraying us with what are called chemtrails. I want you to look at the, and oftentimes before there's a weather front, there are heavy assaults from these planes just before a weather front is changed and comes in. Military and some commercial jets have been fitted with huge barrels of at least 49 different kinds of documented chemical poisons. Among other documented ingredients in this toxic man-made clouds are pathogenic molds, fungi, weaponized viruses, and made in some places like the secret site at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is supposed to be a cancer site, but there are a number of scholars and professors tracking this that have big questions about this. Barium and nanoaluminum particles. What do these do to the human body? Barium is an alkaline earth mineral. It was discovered in 1774. At low doses, it can act as a muscle stimulant. At high doses, it detrimentally affects the heart and the nervous system. Barium is toxic to all mammals, and that means not just humans. Aluminum, which is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, is known to diminish kidney function, and destroy brain cells and cognitive function. Just think about it. Just between the aluminum and the mercury that we're breathing all the time, we've got already a serious issue about brain function and cognitive function. There is also documented evidence that the aluminum in chemtrails is released as nanoparticles, and that when they reach the Earth environment for wildlife, in lakes and streams, it's causing serious problems with wildlife there. Researchers are also finding that nanoparticles interfere with the growth of plants. Nanotechnology is totally unregulated. Just this past month, a new research report came out showing and documenting for the first time that these nanoparticles actually go through the skin. Well, if you breathe them, whether they go through the skin or whether you're inhaling them, it's still a problem, a serious problem. Other toxic chemicals that have been documented include ammonia, ammonium chloride, bismuth, cadmium, one of the most toxic elements also in the environment, hexabromobenzene, lead, potassium iodine, potassium perchlorate, sulfur, and xylene. This is just a toxic spew of carcinogens, serious respiratory and skin irritants, cardiovascular and gastrointestinal toxicants. I'm asking, is there a relationship between asthma, now the #3 killer in the United States, and staggering rates of it for small children, up from #10 a decade ago, and the chemtrails? According to Clifford Carnicom, who's been studying chemtrails for 9 years now, and I met with him to discuss this in detail this summer, quote, "The true nature of these aerosol operations remain undisclosed and closed to fair examination by the public. All of this is being done by stealth to keep us in ignorance." There is a long, long history in the United States, tragically, not the kind of history that you learn in college textbooks, about secret chemical exposure to which Americans were subjected. I'd like to read you just a few of them. In 1931, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, under the auspices of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Investigations, infected human subjects with cancer cells. They were not told about it. He later went on to establish the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Facility in Maryland, Utah, and Panama, and then was named to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. While there, he began a series of radiation exposures, experiments on American soldiers and civilians in hospitals. In 1942, Chemical Warfare Services began mustard gas experiences on approximately 4,000 servicemen. The experiments continued until 1945 and made use of the Seventh-day Adventists who chose to become human guinea pigs rather than serve on duty. 1965, prisoners in a prison in Philadelphia were subjected to dioxin. Dioxin is so toxic, it is a byproduct of chlorine when it breaks down, whether it's in Clorox or in tampons, and a teaspoon could literally kill the entire planet. Dioxin is a carcinogen, and it's part of Agent Orange. That was suspected even before the military used it for Desert Storm. In 1996, the Department of Defense admits that Desert Storm exposure for all of the military, they were exposed to chemical agents, including Agent Orange. So I have questions that have to be part of an urgently needed public discussion and outcry. When is this going to stop? Obviously, you don't know, and I would urge you, they're outside. There's a list of websites that you can go to, not just to Clifford Carnicom's, but this is the most, his website is the most well-documented one with lots of medical information. I've talked to over 100 doctors just in this past 6 months, naturopaths, MDs, all sorts of people in healthcare, and there we have staggering rates of upper respiratory and cardiovascular problems that we never used to have. There's a brand new emerging field, and that's called environmental cardiology, and they're not even dealing with the issues of weather modifications and chemtrails. I'd like to know, how are the real drought conditions by nature exacerbated by a constant spew of aerosols in the chemtrails? How much of global warming or climate change is actually caused by billions of tons of these aerosols that have been sprayed over us for the last 8 years without our permission? It's not just CO2 emissions that we have to deal with, but we have to deal with weather modification. How is weather modification by the military destabilizing our planet's natural weather? A controversial weather modification bill was just passed. Bush just signed it to the 109th Congress. There was no public discussion. These bills did not include any agricultural, water, EPA, or public representatives, and did not have any provisions for congressional, state, county, or public oversight of either expenditures, medical, and/or environmental consequences. In other words, we've really been guinea pigs for at least the last 8 years with literally every breath we take. 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What we are breathing now, as one of my dear friends says, the indoor air is just the same. What the indoor air is just the outdoor air inside. In addition, the Pentagon is on record this summer as saying it wants to resume open-air testing of biologic weapons. There's a flyer outside on this with some research that Professor Francis Boyle has done. And he's been quoted recently as saying, the Pentagon is fully prepared to launch biological warfare by means of anthrax. All the equipment has been acquired and all the training conducted, and most combat-ready members of the U.S. Armed Forces has been given protective equipment and vaccine. Do you know that as of October 1st, how many of you know that we are on an anthrax alert that was issued by the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Anybody know? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people.
I think we have to move along to lunch, Ilya.
So I would like to say that we don't have Star Trek technology. It's just a Hollywood fantasy. Yet much of this technology is being used on us without our permission. We are signatories to no germ warfare and to the Nuremberg trials. This is our home. This is our home. Earth is our home. We don't have Star Trek technology to go to another planet. We have consequences that are moral and ethical in their ramifications, and we don't need to have any more toxins. Our planet will survive, but we will not with these staggering rates of health issues. And I ask you, do we want to live on a planet that is a sewer? Think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.